everyone. Good afternoon. Okay, you've got two African women on the stage, so we're going to do a bit of call and response. When we say good afternoon, you say... Okay, we're going to try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. There is life, Catherine. There is life.
We're not alone.
We're not alone. We're not alone.
Oh,
welcome, welcome, welcome. If you thought this was where you digest your food silently before the next session, this is not that space. We will be hopefully getting into the details of making gender part of every story. Welcome to our session. My name is Eliza Anyangwe. Oh, let's see. Yes, okay. We're at the first slide. So my name is Eliza Anyangwe. I am the editor-in-chief. I have promoted myself. I am the managing editor of As Equals, which is CNN's gender inequality reporting project, and I am joined by...
My name is Gicheru. I don't know what I am today. Depends on the day of the week, but I'm the founder director of Africa Women Journalism Project, and I'm really, really happy to be one of the people that Anastasia asked us to curate this particular chat. I'm also a journalist, so at the end of the day, I say all those things, but I'm really a journalist at heart. And my main interest is to work with women journalists. And looking in the room, we're in the majority, so we're in good
company. Yes. Yeah. Fabulous. Thank you to all the people we paid at lunchtime. Thank you. Yeah. Right, okay, so why are we here? Let's do some context setting. I thought that the session, if anybody was listening to it earlier with the journalist from Serbia, Andela, was really a really strong example of the kinds of work that Catherine and I champion. But why are we here? Okay, so this is an intro to the organizations that we work for. Feel free, if you want to find out more, to scan that QR code. This is the one that I lead. We are a 3-year funded project by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I do no breaking news. All we do is slow, thoughtful, structural, systemic, or journalism around gender issues. We don't do what I would even call representation journalism. So these are not the stories, meet the first girl from Sudan to play chess, or, we are looking at 50% of the world's population. So every time we say women, we mean that expansively: women, genderqueer people, non-binary people. And we are essentially doing public interest journalism, basically asking, what does this population care about? How do the ways in which we report on all other issues affect them? And how do we bring them into the story? Where is the why are we here slide gone? Can you see it? Fab.
Yeah.
So the reason that I have the great pleasure of joining Catherine in conversation is because, as we've just touched on a little bit, this is just a selection of some of the work that we have done on As Equals, but it is really trying to get folks to think about gender issues in the same way we think about the economy. So, how does our economic systems affect our lives? In the same way we think about our political systems, how do those affect our lives? And how does the body you are in, the gender identity that you're given, shape the ways in which you are able to access services, your access economic means, etc. Our team focuses predominantly on covering the majority world, or as other people refer to it, the global South. And you will see that we have done stories around maternal mental health, hugely impactful and deeply underreported. We have called out UN institutions for not giving money where money is due. We also punch up, as I call it, by reporting, for example, as you've seen there, on virginity testing, where the British government was testing women who were migrating from the Indian subcontinent in the 70s, and where the government then tried to present itself as being anti-virginity testing, as though this was something that only happens in those communities. Our reporting showed that it was state policy from the British government for a while. And then doing more explainer-type content. Everybody around the Barbie movie was talking about patriarchy, but what actually is it? So explaining the systems that impact on women and girls' lives. And the framing of this our conversation was around challenges and opportunities. So Catherine, what are the challenges of gender reporting? Like why do you think we need to make gender part of every story to begin with?
You're talking about 50%. In some countries, it's 51% of the population. So if you're not talking about, with, for, then essentially what you're doing is you have an echo chamber. I mean, when I think in terms of the challenges, I keep on asking myself, okay, who is making decisions as to who is going to be reported? What are we reporting? You talked about economics, you talked about climate change. You're talking about a whole 50% of the community you're working in, but you don't see them, you don't hear them. So for me, I think the obvious thing is the first challenge is accepting the reality and accepting and being humble as journalists, as news organizations, that we are actually failing in our responsibility as journalists when we say we are being representative if we don't even accept or even acknowledge that we are not talking about 51%. In Kenya, it's 51% of the population because we don't see us, we don't hear us. And when you frame any story, it's from the perspective of a male. The expert you talk about is and by the way, it's not only in Kenya, I think it's the same thing in Greek media, where I think women representation is something to write home about. You're not the best when you look in terms of the gender equity in Europe. So one of the obvious challenges is acknowledging that. The other thing is also resourcing. I don't know, if I was to ask by a show of hands, how many newsrooms have put aside not only resources, but even personnel to work on climate change? By a show of hands, don't be shy. How many newsrooms? Invariably, a lot of the newsrooms have done that. Yeah? They've put aside money to report on climate change. But one of the things I keep on asking myself, okay, so climate change is a big thing, but you're giving so much money, but you're forgetting to give money to talk about human beings who are being impacted by climate change. So there is this tendency to want, I don't know whether you want to call it like the current flavor of the month is peanut butter, so we want to jump onto that. I don't understand, yet everybody knows vanilla has been around forever and it's the basis of most of the taste we are enjoying, or we know how to enjoy. So again, it's failing to understand or to resource gender reporting. That's a huge challenge also. And I think it needs to be kind of addressed in the sense that if we can spend money on climate change, but we don't spend money on how climate change is, how gender affects, or how climate change is, how people who are of different genders, especially women, are affected by climate change, then we're losing the whole conversation, we're losing track of what is really important at the end of the day.
Absolutely. I think that we, given the subjects that we're speaking about, owe it to the panel that was up earlier talking about disability in the newsroom, because they did a lot of that legwork in explaining to the audiences here both the questions about audiences, but also that question about how it impacts on your content. And there is a risk that people see this as the things that worthy newsrooms do, right? That if you are a progressive newsroom, that this only concerns you, whereas actually this is just fundamental to being good reporters. How do you do your work well if you are discounting the ways in which the systems that you're reporting, when you're speaking truth to power, you do not understand how power impacts on half of the people in your audience. But I thought that it would be useful for us to ground our conversation in the Greek reality, right? Because it's a wonderful thing to be part of an international event and to have international examples, but I feel most of our audience are Greek, and so perhaps it's useful to include a Greek example. So there is a UN report that came out 2 years ago, I believe, and here's what it said about the situation in terms of gender in Greece. as people in Greece highlighted to us, so the us are the UN experts on human rights who did the research, gender equality is a human right. It is not a luxury for better times. It must be placed at the heart of economic and social recovery. The experts said Greece was lagging behind other countries in the European Union on women's rights despite legal and policy frameworks being in place because of poor implementation, the persistence of discrimination, and the lingering impacts of the crisis and austerity measures. Currently, Greece has the lowest rates of women's employment in the European Union and is the lowest ranking country in the Gender Equality Index for EU countries. The situation for marginalized groups, such as migrant and Roma women, is even worse. As far as I'm concerned, as a journalist, all of that is ripe ground for reporting, right? It's areas in which, if I was setting up my newsroom and trying to report on the countries that I'm in, how much of my reporting is looking at women's unemployment or underemployment? How much of it is looking at how austerity impacts specifically on women? The details you will see on the screen. Last year, I helped set up something called the Gender Beat, which is a collective of journalists that are trying to advocate for more and better gender journalism, taking our influence or being inspired by what we see in climate reporting, and creating community for gender reporters, again focusing on basically outside of the West, so whether that is parts of Eastern Europe or the Balkans, but also the Global South. In that report that you see on your screen, I do implore anyone who is interested to look into it. I won't read the details now because we don't have the time, but it really summarizes everything that Catherine was saying about the amount of news coverage. So are women the subject of your journalism? Mm-hmm. Are women and genderqueer people reflected and represented in the voices of your stories? So are they just the victims, or are they experts that you speak to about whatever the subject is? And how are they situated in your newsroom? And they might be the lowest paid and populations in your newsroom, but how many of them are also in leadership? And it's about looking at these three things together and not just about women in leadership, because if the incentives in journalism is to report on war, for example, then a woman editor will report on war too, right? If that's what sets her up and makes her reputation. So it's about making the case for the subjects as well as the people.
I think it's not only that. One of the things which struck me when you're talking about Greece is that there's the legal environment, there are the laws that exist, but the implementation, the enforcement of it hasn't made any difference. So the challenges that women journalists are facing in Greece are sounding so familiar, and they sound so familiar. I'm also like saying, sister, don't worry, we're together. But we do not have the legal environment in some of our countries that you do have. So in a way, it's kind of a wake-up call saying that even though we may have the correct, if you want to use the word correct, we may have the legal environment, we may have the interest. Sometimes this struggle is not going to be ending, and it's not going to change things. Just like you say, depending on whether the editor, the focus is on war, it doesn't change if there's a woman editor.
Absolutely. So
really, at the end of the day, is not thinking, oh, okay, we have the laws, we have this. You need to think about the whole environment. Absolutely. And I'm so proud to say that one of the things I keep on, and I'm sorry, we keep on fighting with, but we are in the same direction. And I have seen my sister here called Khadija. But the idea is to push not only to have more women in positions of authority, but actually making a change in how we look at things. Totally. So if it's climate change, which is the flavor of the month, or war, which is the flavor of the month, how do we bring a gender perspective Absolutely. To this nonsense? Because at the end of the day, if we do not do that, we're just, again, speaking to ourselves. And I don't mean us. the ones making the decisions are talking to each other in the boys' room, not the rest of us.
I think you're starting to speak to some of the opportunities that we've
Yeah,
identified, right?
exactly.
Because a lot of newsrooms, we know the state of journalism today. We know that there is market failure. And we know that, let's be honest, large philanthropic organizations like the Gates Foundation are not necessarily funding local or small media organizations, right? They are interested in scale. So if you're hearing this talk and you're thinking, but we don't have the money to set up a gender vertical or a vertical that looks at gender and sexuality issues, the point that Catherine was making about taking a lens to something is also really important. It's really important to ask, I think that these verticals exist as a response to historical failures in newsrooms, right? That when an event happened, we only looked at it through a very narrow lens, and so then if you found yourself outside of that, so if you cared about the environment or about racial equality or about gender equality, you found that the issues that you cared about weren't reflected in the analysis of the story, and in a response, newsrooms then said, oh, let's set up verticals, right?
Yeah.
Gender team exists.
Gender desk.
Identity team exists. But actually what should be happening is that when an event happens, there is a lens at which you apply. Sometimes I ask, maybe that lens should be who is worst affected or what is worst affected, and you might find that the impact is mostly environmental or minoritized groups within your society.
Yeah.
So if you can't set up a desk or a beat, or you should train your teams to apply a lens to everything that they're doing, because we know that there are differentiated impacts based on your power, based on your visibility, and that is not just something to feel worthy about. Those are stories that can be told, particularly for newsrooms that are interested in public interest journalism.
And I just wanted to, you've been working in newsrooms for a long time, so you know this. She's still in the newsroom. I left it 2 days ago. But seriously, what are some of the things, the values you see when you I'm asking you this because you're still in the newsroom, that when it comes to gender reporting, applying the gender perspective to stories makes a difference. Because I think people think it's like climate change, you need a lot of money, and I love this whole thing, small newsrooms concept, where everybody's, AI for small newsrooms. But I'm interested in how can we do more gender reporting without the resources that you may have had from the Bill and Melinda Gates. I want to change how my newsrooms report on women, about women, on issues of interest to women. How do we do that? And I'm asking you this as somebody who's in the newsroom. I've been out too long.
I'm someone in a newsroom, but I'm someone also who has spent, I was at The Guardian before. Probably the smallest newsroom I worked for was the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. Colleagues in the audience, former colleagues. But yeah, so it's true that there's a difference in resources, but that question that I mentioned about why you should do it, there was also another talk that I was listening to about the value of collaboration. Too often the way journalism is conceived, which is why gender doesn't come up so much, right? Because we are more focused on the exceptional, and a lot of, for example, gender-based violence is daily. So then newsroom editors, we heard a lot of reporters say, I can't convince an editor to commission this story because when I pitch it, they say, oh, not that again, right? And so because the ways in which newsrooms and journalists are trained on the exceptional means that actually the daily violences or daily discriminations become too commonplace to report on. In the same way, the ways in which our newsrooms and our organizations are set up to value that those who get there first and those who get there alone means that we're not set up for collaboration. And yet, a lot of these issues, when you look at the pushback against comprehensive sexual education or the ways in which gender is being dragged in Europe into the culture wars, you get a narrow perspective on that if you're looking at Hungary or just Italy. But if you zoom out and see where money is flowing that is supporting far-right ideology around gender or the or teaching of comprehensive sexual education, you have a big story there, but that requires people to work collaboratively to uncover it. I was thinking before we go to questions about just, perhaps to appeal to different types of people to share some of the impact of this work, that one of the advantages of doing this work isn't just that you are able to speak to audiences that you have long ignored, or that you are able to set your newsroom apart, is that you are able to also make real-world impact. And I think a lot of journalists get into it for idealistic reasons. We want to change the worlds in which we work, and so these are 6 examples from my own work that I can share. The top one, where there's a face that is circled, is my deputy on my team. We have a series, or we had a series called White Lies, which was all about skin whitening. And there she is, and all those other people work for UN agencies or in science and for WHO, etc. That she was the only journalist invited to come and share the reporting that we've been doing to help influence how the policymakers or the technocrats do their work. There is a real opportunity for journalism to make plain what some of the researchers and the scientists and the technical folks have been working on. The picture in the middle is Guterres, the head of the UN, and he was being forced to answer, held to account by Christiane Amanpour based on the reporting our team did that you would have seen in the other picture. The point of that as impact is that actually when you treat gender journalism not as sort of frivolous or, women's issues, which could be in Cosmo magazine, but actually as serious reporting issues, if you report them that way, then your policymakers are held to account on those issues and have to speak to them. I won't talk to them all. You will see below that you can also set the news agenda. Last year, my team, for a year, covered every single presidential election around the world, asking one question: how are women impacted? What is at stake for women in this election? What we did was, in doing so, newsrooms that are always looking for story ideas picked that up. So you will see our story went up on the 7th of April, and then a week later, France 24 did exactly the same story with the same headline practically. That is not a problem. What I'm saying is that's exactly what I want. I want other newsrooms that would not have thought that reporting on the gender perspective in an election is important to actually see that they're missing a trick and to do it too, right? To start to influence coverage in other newsrooms.
I was just going to say the most important reason why we should do more gender reporting, the really important one, because I guess most of the editors will be thinking about the bottom line. Why should I do it? It makes sense, man. It makes business sense. I have more eyes to look at my content, which means I might be able to sell stuff at them. But really think about it. If right now you don't have women as your core audience, then what business are we saying, oh, our business model is hurting us, business, we're going down? I mean, seriously? I mean, for me, if you're not going to be motivated by your journalistic responsibility, think about your survival. And I guess that might be the one thing that might spur people into supporting and doing more gender reporting, because I think we care more about survival than being nice and good. So
Absolutely.
for me, that's the one thing, like I'm saying, if for nothing else, let's do it because our survival depends on it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And
all
that's
of these...
my last word.
No,
I don't want to say more because I know we have time for questions.
All right, well, let's get to that then. Let us open up to the floor. We have 7 minutes and 23 seconds. Please tell us, ask your questions, tell us your comments and thoughts. We threw a lot at you in a very small amount of time.
Yeah.
Any questions from the floor?
Any concerns?
Anyone now convinced to take up reporting more gender issues than who had done so before in their newsrooms? Oh, we have no questions and we have convinced no one, Catherine.
This is not good.
Yes, there is a hand here at the front and one here too.
And there's one behind over there. Yeah, two actually.
Thank you. This is quite a specific one. I mean, you covered a lot of ground really well. But one specific one is how useful you think it is to put into practice things like source auditing, because one of the things that was flagged in the stats is who gets quoted, who do you go to as experts, and who do you go to shared lived experience, and are there two separate groups, and do those groups have different demographics? So I think there are more organisations now doing source audits, but I'm just really keen to hear your thoughts on, you know, are they useful? How should we be thinking about sources, and how should we kind of mainstream that in newsrooms better?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try and answer it quickly. It's, again, resource dependent. Like, I think it's the FT that have created a bot that does it for all their work.
Yeah.
When I was managing editor, The Correspondent, we didn't have the technology, and I hired someone to go through all of our year's input. I also think transparency is really important about that. I think actually that's the major advantage of doing source audits, is that actually when you do it and you are transparent about the results, it prompts your team. It basically changes the incentives in your newsroom, right? Like the stuff that I was showing around impacts, things like Emmy nominations or awards or that type of things. If leaders in newsrooms share that in the newsrooms, what they're saying to their staff is that those are the things we care about. When you also share publicly your audits, who are we quoting, how many of them were from which communities, that also then starts to set the tone in your newsroom about what you care about. I do think that when we move more towards the space of like participatory journalism or collaborative investigations, where we want to center people with experience, we also need to be careful to not overburden people who are already overburdened, right, in their lives. And that's also very gendered. So if you're saying, okay, women have experience and we should bring them in to share their experience, and we're not paying them and we're not allowing, you know, then that is already somebody who has the double burden of working in some capacity, looking after her family, and now we're saying, oh, journalism includes you, come and do part of our work for us for free. We have to be really mindful about how we do that.
Yeah.
I think there was a question over here.
Hello, we noticed with time since COVID and after COVID that has been more and more online harassment, hate speech against female journalists in our region. I'm talking about Middle East and North Africa. Some of the females are really seriously thinking of leaving the career or publishing in anonymous names. They no longer publish in their names. Is this something you have been noticing globally, and where do you think our combating should be focusing on? Thanks.
Yeah, there's been that, and I think it wasn't, I think even just before COVID, that situation was there, but it got worse during COVID. And after, yes, I think it's a global problem. In Africa, I think we've been having similar problems, similar challenges, but one of the things which I have to say is trying to find solutions that matter to us. There are very many international interventions that have been organized either by IWMF and others to try and mitigate against the kind of harassment that we've been exposed to, which sometimes has translated into offline attacks. But I think we need to localize some of those interventions and take on the authorities and our governments. And where possible, and this I mean where possible, it's necessary, not possible, is we need to present a united front to the platforms, not go as a small country. Who cares about Kenya? They won't even listen to you. To present a united front, not only as women, but also as countries, where we can compel these platforms to try and take action against some of these situations. Because it's not only a Kenyan problem, it's not a MENA problem, it's a global problem. And there are those who have voices louder than others, is to present a united front. But the one thing I keep on telling, and I think I told some young ladies earlier today, is you need to be able to know how to take care of yourself online as a journalist. As a woman journalist, it's imperative you need to figure out what are the best ways to deal with those kind of challenges within the limitations of your community, your society, and your space, and look for solidarity across the different countries. But really, be mindful, be cautious, and take those precautions that you need to before it gets to the point where somebody wants to kill you for nothing.
And I think that the only thing I would add to that, because I think all of that is true and fantastic, is that how we cover online violence when it doesn't involve us is exactly how people perceive it when it does. I think that the media has a huge role to play in presenting online violence as though it is less real than offline violence. And so therefore we take this differentiated approach to when it happens, when it happens to women. And when you speak to anybody who deals with online hate, the one thing that they keep saying is, online hate, digital hate is real hate, or digital harm is real harm. And so because we don't think it is real, and because it is disproportionately happening to women, the approach within newsrooms, and sometimes it's not even happening, we also assume that it's in like the dark corners of the web. We did a story where the former president of Slovenia, I think it was, anyway, where heads of state and people with power are mobilizing their followers to attack women online, right? This is not just kind of like small, inconsequential people, and that making that connection in our reporting is just as important as, training our staff and supporting them and, and going collectively to the platforms to ask for them to do better. But I also think that actually when you take this gender lens, then you're a bit more nuanced in what you're advocating for. So take, for example, sexual imagery. You know that women's sexualized images are used to dox women online. But to say that the solution is just to go after platforms so that they censor everything, we also know that's, for example, harming young women who turn to social media and to safe spaces online to learn about sex, right? Because they're not learning about it in school, they're not learning, so they're looking on Instagram for people who they trust, and those platforms are no longer able to show the material that was used to train and to teach young women, partly because journalism is saying all nudity online is harmful nudity. And so actually when you take this lens, you create a much more nuanced perspective to cover multiple angles. I know we have come to time. I just want to be sure, yes, okay. Their eyes looking at us from over there. So if anyone else had any questions, please do come and find us. But Catherine and I would just love to say thank you for being alert and awake during our session at 4:30. Thank you.
Thank you.